Well, thank you, first of all of you for coming out here tonight, and thank you, Tammy, for hosting the event. Thank you very much. But what I really want to talk about tonight is basically to warn America not to go down the same Islamic route that Europe, particularly so Britain, finds itself on at the moment. Britain is almost on the point of no return, or no peaceful return. And when Samuel Huntington wrote his book, presciently entitled The Clash of Civilizations, he referred there to something that he called the illusion of permanency. And this is very important, I think, because no one in Britain expects tomorrow to be any different to today, or this time next year, or the year after that. No one really expects anything to change in the next 15 or 20 years. But Britain is going to change greatly in the next 50 years, precisely because of what has been going on over the last 50 years. And the reason, of course, is mass immigration and Muslim demographics. Now, when I talk about the illusion of permanency, this illusion is easy to maintain when the British are racially as they have been for hundreds and hundreds of years, and when the Muslim population was only numbering in the tens of thousands, which it was just back in the 1960s. But that's no longer the case. Tony Blair's government opened the doors to Britain completely, wide open to mass immigration. And he did it with the express intention of changing the traditional culture of my country. And the cat was let out of the bag by one of his speechwriters, Mr. Andrew Neither, who actually admitted that their primary goal was to absolutely destroy traditional cultural Britain and to rub the noses of the right wing in multicultural diversity. Well, they've been very successful. You know, England is a tiny country. It makes up less than 1% of the world's habitable landmass, contains just 1% of the world population. It also has a no questions asked welfare state. Now, this enables immigrants to live in far better surroundings than in their own countries. So when a tiny little country like Britain, relatively rich, overly generous, invites the billions from the third world to enter, they're going to enter, and then they're going to swamp it. And we have already been swamped. Sam Solomon wrote a book about Islamic immigration into the West and jihad called The Trojan Horse. And he described the jihadist ideology behind this. The liberal left denounced Sam Solomon as some sort of racist, some sort of Nazi, but the Islamists are very, very aware of the power of infiltration into the West. Abu Basir is a London-based spiritual advisor to Anwar al-Islam, which is just one of a number of jihadist organizations based in London. Now, he had this to say about Islamic immigration into the West. One of the goals of immigration is the revival of the duty of jihad and enforcement of power over the infidels. Immigration and jihad go together. One is the consequence of the other and dependent upon it. The continuation of one is dependent upon the continuation of the other. Or how about Colonel Gaddafi? We have 50 million Muslims in Europe. There are signs that Allah will grant Islam victory. Without guns, without swords, without conquests, the 50 million Muslims in Europe will turn it into an Islamic continent within the next few decades. Now, these are very honest and forthright statements of very clear intent by people who mean what they're saying. Goes right over the heads of leftist politicians, though. We have a former Labour minister, Tony Benn. Now, his view on this is slightly different. He said, this diversity provides a delightful snapshot of life in multicultural Britain. The world today is such a small place, which makes us so lucky to have so many different people from so many different backgrounds. Multicultural Britain is now here to stay, so isn't it great that we are all finally learning to live alongside each other? Now, this naivety is astonishing, bordering on the criminality, but not all on the excuse me, not all on the liberal left. Think along these sort of lines. There's a writer for the Salisbury Review, Patricia Morgan. Now, one of her left-wing friends some years ago was expressing disquiet about Islamic terrorism in Britain, and she actually asked him why he had been so keen on getting as many Muslim immigrants into the country as possible, and he replied, "I was trying to make the revolution. So while it had not been possible to storm Buckingham Palace and to set up Soviets in Westminster, we could change the population and supplant the hated other." Now, the hated other is me. It's my family. It's my community. It's my people, and it's my country. Change the population and supplant the hated other. What a wicked and treacherous notion this is. And they succeeded. If you want to look to the future of my country, you only have to look at our primary schools. In London, white British school children now account for only 20% of the school population. I'll say that again, 20% of the school population. And this is happening all over the country. All England's other schools are going precisely the same way, in precisely the same manner. And the non-Indigenous birth rate in Britain now is 35% nationally, which means in the cities somewhere between 70 and 80%. Now, this consigns all English children to an ethnic minority over the next decade in all of our cities and across the country as a whole by 2030, 18 years from now. And the fact that this has been accomplished deliberately to further left-wing revolutionary ideology, to me it's treason. To me it's treason. And during Tony Blair's government, they actually issued booklets in the British Embassy in Pakistan explaining why Britain was such a good place to emigrate to, including our fantastically generous welfare state. And the chief official in Britain who was in charge of issuing visas, a Miss Linda Costello-Baker, actually told a House of Commons Select Committee that her department was under intense political pressure to hit immigration productivity targets. She also said it was easier to let them in than to reject applications, and over the course of 1 year alone of 2 million visas issued, she estimates 15% were issued to people who not only shouldn't be there, but were convicted terrorists and criminals in their own countries of origin. Now, exact population figures in Britain are very hard to come by. The authorities maintain there's around about 60 million British people, population of Britain. The Independent newspaper, based on supermarket food sales, estimates it at 78 million people, and this figure is borne out by the amount of national insurance cards in circulation, which are essential if you want to work or claim benefits, and that's 76 million. So it looks as though there's somewhere between 16 and 18 million people in my country who came in the last 10, 12, 15 years that we don't even know about. Now, clearly not all immigrants are Muslims, but they make up a sizable majority, and their high birth rate, which averages in Britain 4 children per woman, I'm not going to say per couple, because Muslim males can claim welfare benefits and housing costs for up to 4 wives and various children, even though polygamy is actually illegal in Britain. So this, coupled with uncontrolled immigration, has essentially doubled their population from the 1960s, when it was only 80,000. In 1990, it was 1 million. In 2000, it was 2 million. And we reckon it's somewhere between 3 to 4 million people now. 3 to 4 million Muslims. Now this is exactly why the next 50 years will be nothing like the last 50 years. Because when the Muslim population doubled from 50,000 to 100,000, nobody's really affected by this, except for the few Brits who live in the emerging Muslim enclaves. But when 3 million Muslims today become 6 million Muslims in 2020, become 12 million, become 24 million, then everyone is affected, because at that point we've lost our country. We've lost my country. And it gets worse. The indigenous British have roughly 1.5 children per couple, which means that today's generation being born is 25% smaller than their parents' generation. And the population pyramids of most European countries are upside down, by which I mean there are more elderly than there are young, but amongst the Muslims the population pyramids are the right way up, and the young greatly outnumber the old. And the Muslim demographic in Britain right now is growing 10 times faster than any other religious stroke racial demographic. Now, the figures I'm going to give you now, this is quite important, they are all under the age of 40. It's not going to be a general population breakdown, but it's only under the age of 40. So the indigenous population today, under the age of 40, 25 million. Non-indigenous population, 6.75 million. If we project these figures forward based on birth rates on their side and based on the fact that we're declining, and we push them forward to 2030, 18 years from now, indigenous population 19 million, non-indigenous population 13.5 million. But it gets worse and worse, because every year 250,000 native Brits, sick to the back teeth of multicultural Britain, are upping sticks and emigrating. If we take this into account and continued third world immigration, by 2030 the indigenous population will be 15 million people and the non-indigenous population 23 million people. So under the age of 40 we will have become an ethnic minority in our own country. The liberal left, of course, will say, so what? What's wrong with that? It's multiculturalism in action. Nothing wrong with that unless you're a racist or a bigot. Suppose they're wrong, though. Suppose young Muslim males don't share this fluffy multicultural view that the liberal left share. Supposing they want to inflict upon us a very illiberal, monocultural Islamic rule over us. What can we do about it? And I use these younger population figures for two reasons. Now, the first is just to show our immediate demographic future, but the second is to draw attention to the fact that 18 to 40-year-old males are, of course, traditional military fighting age. It doesn't matter if they're outnumbered today by a superior force of grey-haired old ancient Brits. It doesn't matter at all. The only important thing is that very, very soon they will outnumber our potential indigenous defenders of my country. Right-wing hysteria, is this right-wing hysteria and right-wing paranoia? It simply isn't. People grounded in reality and knowledge understand that the history of man is war. It's the liberal left, with their naive sentimentality, who seem to think that the future of man is peace, despite all historical and empirical knowledge to the contrary. And it's always been driven. Conflict has always been driven by racial, religious and tribal ambition. And we're seeing this already in Britain. 40% of British Muslims want to live under Sharia law. There are constant news items about the radicalisation of young Muslim males. We saw the sickening rejoicing in British city streets. Rejoicing in British city streets after the mass murder here in New York on 9/11. Constant news about thwarted terrorist attacks in Britain, and this comes on top of our own bombings in 2005. London transport bombings killed 52 people and maimed 700. Constant news about mosques selling literature, calling for the overthrow of British democracy. Constant news of calling for the murder of British Jews and British homosexuals, and for the subjugation of the non-Islamic infidel, and the desire to install a global Islamic caliphate. We see this day in, day out in our newspapers, week in, week out, year in, year out. And this is today. What are we going to see in the future, where the 18 to 40-year-old demographic is larger than ours? We only have to look around the world today to see an answer to this. One example is Lebanon. It used to be a Christian majority country, but as the Islamic demographic grew, so did their demand for control. And in 1975, this triggered a 15-year civil war, killing 10% of the population, wounding 33%, some of them for life, half of them actually, for lifetime disabilities, and the entire Christian leadership was exiled, jailed, or murdered. This is our future. This is maybe not yours yet, but this is my future in England. Britain's security services will not be able to hold back Islamic terrorist attacks forever. They're going on at roughly 3-4 a week right now in Britain. And I fully expect when the next one gets through, as it must eventually, that some indigenous British hothead is going to take some revenge by going out and murdering a Muslim somewhere in Britain, or by torching a mosque. And so we'll start that long progressive slide into civil war. Little tit-for-tat atrocities becoming ever more vicious until eventually the entire country goes the way of the Lebanon or Yugoslavia, which of course fractured on racial, religious and tribal lines. The left will laugh at this, of course, some future Armageddon predicted by some right-wing Nazi lunatic somewhere. And they continue to tell us that Islam is a religion of peace. But this is just insane. Islam is not and never has been a religion of peace. It's a political, societal and structural order of supremacy and imperialism. Islam in its most fundamental form can only be compared to that of Nazism in its desire for global supremacy, women fit only for the kitchen, the bedroom, the place of prayer, Jews and homosexuals to be murdered, and everybody not of the faith to live their lives as second-class citizens. In fact, it's even worse than Nazism, because not even the most vicious of Nazis ever suggested it was all right to bury a woman up to her shoulders in sand and slowly and methodically stone her to death. Even worse than Nazism, and it's growing everywhere. So what can we do about it? What I'm saying here to you tonight, I couldn't say in Britain. I would be arrested, I'd be taken away, I would have contravened various laws on hate speech, and the government in Britain is out to demonise anybody who dares raise this subject. And in the interest of short-term election cycles, the politicians refuse to talk about it. They're simply going to sweep it under the table because all they care about is the next 4 years, not the next 20 years or the next 40 years. But all this is too important to ignore because the lives of our children are dependent on what we do today. The liberal left politicians fantastically happy with all of this because it provides them, mass immigration provides them with mass votes. The conservatives, who really ought to be trying to conserve something, but aren't, just refuse to talk about it. Or if they do talk about it, it's only to suggest that wouldn't it be a good idea to allow Islamic Turkey to join the European Union. This is their sole contribution to the Islamic question. There is one party that will talk about it, the British National Party, the only one. But they have been quite rightly sidelined in the eyes of decent British people because they really do have a genuine history of racial bigotry, and extraordinarily, their leader is a Holocaust denier. So good, decent British people are not going to get behind this party. So this leaves just one party, which I'm going to promote to you very quickly now, the British Freedom Party, which I'm current chairman of. Now, we want to stop any more mass immigration to Britain. And we want to stop, thank you, and we want to stop the Islamisation of Britain. And we can do this, we can do this quite painlessly. We can say, you can't build any more mosques. No more mosques. If you commit acts of terrorism, we will deport you. If you commit acts of criminality, we will deport you. If you are found guilty of preaching sedition and violence in your mosques, we will close your mosque down. And we will jail the imams that are actually saying this. We can make life uncomfortable for them without actually being particularly unpleasant about it. I think that's fair enough.
It's too fair.
But if we don't do this, we really are, in the very, very near future, going to find ourselves in a situation that's going to be possibly worse than the breakup of Yugoslavia, and that was just horrific carnage, and it happened so recently. We didn't make those sacrifices between 1939 to 1945 simply a few decades later to allow another totalitarian ideology, redolent of Nazism, to come back into our countries and take us over without us even lifting a finger to stop them. We're not going to do that. We're not going to let that happen. We're just not. America has some advantages over Britain. You still have free speech under your First Amendment. You have relatively few Muslims compared to Britain. And one thing that you do have, you have the power of Judeo-Christian religion, which is still here in America. The liberal left declared war on Christianity in Britain 30, 40 years ago, and they've beaten us. It's gone. There are no real Christians in Britain anymore. And removing the driving force of Christianity from Britain has removed a major obstacle to Islam and Islamic ambition in my country. I desperately hope that Britain is not yet too far gone, even though Mark Stein's already written us off. But I've been here for ages. I'll close now just by asking that Americans keep a close eye on what's going on in Europe and in Britain, and call a halt right now, today, immediately, to any further ideological or demographic growth of Islam in the land of the free.
Yeah.
I really implore you not to make the same mistakes that are either naive or treacherous politicians have made in Britain and Europe. And I'm going to fight for Britain, and I suppose in the same time for Europe, but there's no guarantee Britain and Europe can be saved. And if we go, and if America goes shortly thereafter, then so goes Western civilization. The most basically decent, humane and kind civilization in the history of mankind, to be replaced with Islam. The most barbaric, illiberal, totalitarian, pathologically cruel system we have ever seen, that will take the Western world back to the Dark Ages. So please, America, look to Britain and Europe, look, listen and learn. Thank you.